Keanu Reeves was scheduled to appear on one of the most anticipated live talk shows of the year. The host, a well-known figure in the media for their outspoken stance on progressive issues, had built a reputation for pushing celebrities into difficult, politically charged corners. Known for their ability to stir up controversy, the host had a knack for asking celebrities about sensitive topics, particularly those that were currently making waves in the media. Tonight's show was no different. The stage was set, the cameras were rolling, and the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. The audience, a mix of fans and critics, filled the studio, eager to hear what Keanu, a beloved actor known for his calm demeanor and philosophical outlook, would have to say. Keanu, who had earned respect for not engaging in the Hollywood spotlight drama and instead focused on his craft and humility, had agreed to appear on the show. Many believed it would be a standard interview, full of casual questions about his latest projects, a few stories from his career, and some light banter. But those who knew the host's track record were bracing themselves for a fiery exchange, especially with the topic on hand, one that had been dividing public opinion for weeks. The host had made it clear in the pre-show promotions that tonight's interview would dive deep into the woke culture, social movements, and how celebrities should respond to societal issues. It was clear that they intended to take Keanu head-on, and the audience was waiting eagerly for the clash. As Keanu entered the studio, the crowd erupted in applause. He smiled politely, his trademark humble aura filling the room. He greeted the host with a firm handshake, and the tension in the air was palpable. Both the host and the audience knew this wasn't going to be a typical interview. And as the cameras rolled, the host wasted no time. With a sly grin, they leaned forward, prepared to drop the first bombshell question that would set the stage for the evening's debate. The world would soon find out if Keanu would bow to the pressure or if he would stand firm in a way no one expected. The host, clearly ready to stir the pot, leaned forward with a confident smile. They knew the power of a controversial question and how it could spark debate among both the audience in the studio and viewers at home. As the cameras zoomed in, the host's voice rang out, filled with deliberate precision. Keanu, they began, their tone casual yet probing. You've always been a guy who keeps a low profile, avoiding the Hollywood hype and, quite frankly, avoiding the political narratives that so many celebrities get caught up in. But lately, we've seen celebrities publicly aligning themselves with causes that push certain woke ideals. Do you think that, as a celebrity, it's your responsibility to speak up about social justice issues, or do you think there's a danger in pushing an agenda that might alienate your audience? The host's eyes sparkled with the intention behind the question. They wanted to corner Keanu into giving an answer that could either be seen as hypocritical or dismissive. The word woke hung in the air, its meaning loaded with both praise and derision, depending on who was listening. The studio audience fell silent, awaiting Keanu's response. Some were eager to see how he would navigate the minefield of politics and public image, while others already seemed to brace for whatever answer might come next. The host had managed to set the stage perfectly for an intense back and forth, knowing full well that whatever Keanu said would generate discussion. Keanu, as always, sat calmly, his eyes not defensive, but attentive, considering the question with his usual poise. There was no rush to answer. The pressure of the moment didn't seem to faze him in the slightest. It was as though he was processing the question deeply, not just for the sake of his image, but because he genuinely believed in engaging thoughtfully with the world around him. The host, sensing Keanu's calm demeanor, pushed further. Because let's be honest here, today, if you don't take a public stance on these issues, people will accuse you of being complacent or even worse, of being part of the problem. So, Keanu, what do you think? Is staying silent on these matters the same as being complicit? The tension in the room thickened as all eyes were on Keanu. Keanu sat back in his chair, his expression unwavering. The host's question was loaded with political implications, and the pressure to conform to a particular stance was clear. Yet, Keanu remained completely calm, as if he wasn't fazed by the weight of the question or the crowd's expectant silence. His hands rested gently on his knees, his posture relaxed but confident. There was no hint of discomfort, no sign of a defensive posture. He wasn't in a rush to answer, and his silence spoke volumes. The audience, sensing the change in energy, waited in anticipation, trying to read Keanu's next move. Was he going to give in to the pressure? Would he play it safe, or would he confront the question head-on? After a long pause, Keanu finally spoke, his voice measured, steady, and sincere. I think there's a lot more to this conversation than just picking a side or agreeing with one narrative, he began. The idea that celebrities must speak out on every issue, or that we're obligated to take a stand just because it's expected, is a bit reductive. The truth is, every person has their own journey and their own way of engaging with the world. He continued, his tone still calm but increasingly passionate. I do believe in justice. I believe in kindness. I believe in empathy. And I also believe that everyone has the right to voice their opinions, but that doesn't mean we should automatically assume someone is wrong just because their path is different from our own. The studio was silent. It wasn't the response the host expected or the one they had prepared for. Instead of taking the bait or feeling cornered, Keanu had offered a nuanced perspective, one that didn't immediately fit into the polarizing boxes the host had tried to place him in. Keanu leaned slightly forward, locking eyes with the host, his gaze unwavering. I don't think silence equates to complicity. It's not that simple. Sometimes, the loudest voices don't lead to the most meaningful conversations. Sometimes, it's about understanding the complexities and doing the work in quieter, more meaningful ways, rather than seeking approval or applause. The audience shifted in their seats, murmuring softly, trying to process what Keanu had just said. This wasn't a typical celebrity response. This wasn't the soundbite they were expecting. It was honest, it was thoughtful, and it stood in stark contrast to the typical soundbites often delivered in these kinds of interviews. Keanu's ability to articulate his perspective without anger, without the usual political drama, was starting to win over the audience in real time. They were captivated not just by his words, but by the grace and authenticity with which he conveyed them. The host, momentarily taken aback, paused, unsure how to follow up. Keanu had thrown the gauntlet down without being combative. He had simply stated his truth. There was no rush to silence, no push for Keanu to take a side. The atmosphere in the room had shifted completely. What had started as a setup for confrontation was now becoming an unexpected platform for genuine dialogue. For a moment, the host was stunned into silence. The question had been designed to provoke, to force a divisive answer, but Keanu's response had taken the conversation in a completely unexpected direction. The host's confident smile faltered for the briefest moment as they processed Keanu's calm and thoughtful words. The tension in the air had shifted, and the host realized that they were no longer in control of the interview. Trying to recover, the host chuckled nervously, attempting to steer the conversation back onto familiar ground. Well, that's certainly an interesting perspective, Keanu, they said, clearly flustered. But don't you think that by not speaking out on these issues, especially when they're so front and center in today's society, you're missing an opportunity to influence change? Keanu didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, as though he had anticipated this response. Change doesn't happen because of pressure, or because it's the loudest voice in the room. Change happens when people are truly listening to each other, when we stop labeling each other and start understanding one another's stories, he said, his voice soft but firm. The host shifted in their seat, trying to regain the upper hand. But isn't there a responsibility, especially for someone in your position, to speak out against injustice? People look up to you, Keanu. Doesn't that give you a certain moral obligation? Keanu shook his head slightly, his expression thoughtful. I don't believe in the idea of obligation as a weapon. We all have different ways of contributing. Some speak out, some help quietly behind the scenes. It's not about who's the loudest. It's about who is most sincere in their efforts to make things better. The host, now on the defensive, tried to redirect the conversation. So, you're saying that speaking out about injustice is not important? Keanu leaned in, his voice calm and measured. No, I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that we can't reduce it to a simple binary. People can do more than just speak. They can take action in ways that resonate with them. But it has to come from a place of understanding, not just because it's trendy or expected. There was a brief pause as the host processed Keanu's words. They were visibly rattled, trying to think of how to frame their next question, but the dynamic in the room had shifted. The audience, who had been primed for a dramatic clash, was now hanging on every word Keanu said. His message had struck a chord with them, not because it was sensational or controversial, but because it felt grounded in wisdom and authenticity. The host, realizing they couldn't easily trap Keanu into the kind of debate they had hoped for, forced a smile and attempted a more neutral approach. Well, it's clear that you think things through in a way that not many people do, Keanu. And I think that's something we can all agree on. But do you think the rise of woke culture in Hollywood has hurt the way people view celebrities? Keanu, still composed, answered carefully. It's not for me to judge how others view it. But I think, in any culture, we have to be cautious of extremes. We have to find a balance where we can have open dialogue, not just one-sided arguments. When we start labeling people, we miss the point. I think what's more important is the sincerity behind the actions, not the label. The host, now visibly flustered, nodded awkwardly, trying to regain composure. Fair enough, Keanu, they said, but it was clear that they had lost control of the conversation. The crowd, once anticipating a fiery debate, now seemed to be applauding Keanu's level-headedness. Keanu's response, though it lacked the drama the host had sought, had managed to deliver a powerful message. The audience was captivated by Keanu's ability to stay true to his beliefs without being confrontational, and they could feel the authenticity in his words. The host, realizing they couldn't push Keanu into a corner, moved on to a different topic, but the energy in the room had changed. The interview, which had started with tension and a carefully crafted narrative, had turned into a lesson in patience, humility, and the power of listening. Keanu had proven that you didn't need to engage in expected theatrics to make a meaningful impact. His response, in its calmness and clarity, had already left a lasting impression. As the host awkwardly shifted to a new topic, Keanu maintained his composed, grounded demeanor. There was no rush in his responses, no sign of irritation despite the host's attempts to steer the conversation into more contentious territory. It was clear that Keanu was operating on a deeper level, and the words he spoke carried a weight that transcended the usual celebrity banner. Look, Keanu began, sensing the need to explain himself further. I'm not someone who's got all the answers, and I don't claim to be. But I do know that in this world, balance is key. And respect for all perspectives, that's something I hold dear. It's so easy to get caught up in one side, one narrative, and forget that there's a bigger picture. The host, sensing a shift from the earlier tense dynamic, now leaned in with genuine curiosity. So, are you saying that we should just accept everyone's perspective, no matter how extreme it might seem? Keanu shook his head gently, his eyes reflecting sincerity. Not at all. What I'm saying is that we need to engage with each other with the intention of understanding, not just reacting. It's about listening, not just to the loudest voices, but to everyone who's trying to share their truth, no matter how uncomfortable that might be. He paused, letting his words settle in the room. The studio was quieter now, the audience hanging on every syllable. Keanu's calmness was infectious. The tension had eased, and there was a palpable sense of respect for the way he had navigated the interview so far. Real change comes when we can look at the full spectrum of an issue, understand its complexities, and still respect each other's humanity. It's about learning to coexist, not by forcing people into boxes, but by recognizing the value of each person's experience. The host, taken aback by the depth of Keanu's answer, seemed to soften. For a moment, it felt like the entire studio had collectively inhaled and exhaled in unison, as if they too had just learned something important. Keanu was not just giving a political answer, he was speaking about something more universal, more profound. That's a pretty powerful philosophy, Keanu, the host admitted, now looking at him with genuine respect. And I suppose, in a way, it's something we all could use more of, more balance and understanding, especially in a world that's so divided. Keanu nodded. Exactly. It's not about agreeing on everything, but about making room for different viewpoints, listening without judgment, and engaging in real conversations. That's how we move forward, not through division, but through unity and diversity. The host, recognizing that they couldn't trap Keanu into any more antagonistic exchanges, nodded slowly. There was an undeniable sense of admiration in their expression now, as if Keanu had won the interview without ever having to raise his voice or take a side. The audience, once waiting for the next heated exchange, now applauded softly, appreciating the sincerity and maturity that Keanu brought to the conversation. The shift in energy was unmistakable, and Keanu had effortlessly shifted the interview from a potentially hostile debate to a meaningful dialogue about respect, understanding, and the complexities of modern social issues. Keanu didn't need to win the argument. He had simply shown the power of genuine conversation, grounded in humility and a deep respect for others. The host, for the first time in the interview, seemed to be genuinely reflecting on Keanu's words, their role in the conversation no longer that of a provocateur, but of someone who had just been given a rare opportunity to learn from someone who understood balance. The host, still visibly recovering from Keanu's thoughtful and grounded response, wasn't ready to admit defeat. They shifted in their chair, determined to regain some control over the conversation. As a skilled interviewer, they understood the dynamics of media. Controversy got clicks, and this interview was far from the explosive event they had hoped for. Still, Keanu's calmness had left them with little to work with in terms of stirring up a drama-filled segment. After a beat of silence, the host tried again, now more calculated in their approach. Okay, Keanu, I hear what you're saying about balance and respect. But let's talk about the impact that comes with a public voice like yours. You've built a career based on being admired, loved, and respected by people all over the world. Does that influence the way you choose to speak? Or, in this case, choose not to speak on controversial issues? I mean, how do you handle the pressure of potentially alienating your fan base? Keanu, whose patience seemed endless, took a moment before answering. The subtle shift in the host's approach wasn't lost on him. It was clear they were still trying to box him into a more polarized answer, but Keanu wasn't having it. I don't think it's about alienating anyone, Keanu responded thoughtfully. The pressure comes when we try to make it about us as individuals. When we start thinking of ourselves as the solution, we lose sight of what's really important, the people. It's not about what you say for the sake of getting attention. It's about being authentic and doing what's right by the people around you. And when you stay true to yourself, people can feel that, whether they agree with you or not. He paused for a moment, looking around the studio as if to emphasize his point. I think the pressure to speak, to pick a side, or to please everyone is a trap, Keanu continued. You can't be everything to everyone, and trying to do that leads to a false sense of accomplishment. My job as an actor is to tell stories, to entertain, and to maybe offer a little insight into the human condition. But beyond that, I believe that the work we do to make the world better doesn't always have to be done with a microphone in your face. The host, sensing that this wasn't going to lead to the confrontation they hoped for, forced a smile. So, you're saying you can influence change without speaking out loudly for it? Keanu nodded, his tone unwavering. Exactly. It's not about the volume of your voice, but the strength of your actions. That's how you influence change, by living your values, showing up when it matters, and doing what's right. The host, now a little taken aback by the depth of Keanu's response, didn't press further. It was becoming clear that Keanu was not going to be pushed into a polarized argument, and no matter how hard they tried to shape the conversation, he had mastered the art of deflecting with grace and wisdom. The audience, who had been primed for a heated back and forth, now seemed to appreciate Keanu's perspective. There was an underlying tension in the room, but was one of admiration for the way Keanu navigated the conversation, remaining consistent, grounded, and true to his own convictions. The host had attempted several times to twist the narrative, but each time, Keanu's answers shifted the energy, moving the discussion from divisive rhetoric to thoughtful discourse. And as Keanu sat there, unshaken by the host's repeated attempts, it became clear the true power in this conversation was not in the words, but in the message that Keanu was imparting: authenticity, integrity, and the importance of staying true to one's core values. The host, realizing their efforts to trap Keanu into a heated confrontation weren't working, sat back in their chair, slightly frustrated but trying to maintain composure. They had spent most of the interview attempting to draw Keanu into a debate, but it was clear now that Keanu's approach was different from what the host had expected. Keanu wasn't biting. He wasn't angry or defensive. He was calm, collected, and sure of his beliefs, and that was the most powerful weapon he wielded in the room. Not wanting to admit defeat, the host tried a final tactic. Okay, so if you're not going to engage with these current social issues in the typical way, by speaking out, making bold statements, or joining movements, what exactly do you stand for, Keanu? If you don't take a stance on these issues, where does that leave you in terms of being a role model? Keanu looked at the host for a moment, his gaze unwavering. His calmness was the same as it had been since he first stepped on set, but his words now carried an even sharper weight. What I stand for is kindness. I stand for empathy. I stand for honesty, and I stand for being real with people. I think those things matter more than any label or any agenda. I believe that the world needs more people who genuinely care about others, not just those who shout the loudest about what they believe in, Keanu responded, his voice firm but not angry. The host tried to interject, sensing Keanu was about to close the conversation, but Keanu wasn't finished. I also believe that we all have our own paths to walk, our own journeys. And I don't think anyone should feel pressured to take a certain stance just to fit in or to appease an audience. My job is to be myself, not to perform a role that others expect of me. I'm not here to tell people how they should think or live. What I am here to do is be a human being, just like everyone else, trying to figure it out as I go. Keanu's words were direct, his message cutting through the noise of the conversation. The host, for the first time, had no immediate response. They had been hoping for a soundbite, a dramatic retort that would spark controversy, but instead, they were faced with something far more profound: a reminder that real leadership, real influence, comes from authenticity, not from bending to expectations. Keanu's response wasn't aggressive, it wasn't defensive, it was simply his truth. And that truth, as simple and unassuming as it was, struck the audience deeply. The crowd, which had been uncertain about the direction of the interview, now sat in silent respect. They could feel the power of Keanu's words reverberating in the room. The host, now visibly thrown, could do little more than nod in acknowledgement. The conversation had shifted from a one-sided narrative into a dialogue about what it means to truly live your values, not just preach them for the sake of approval. For Keanu, the interview was never about winning or losing. It was about standing firm in his beliefs and showing that kindness, respect, and authenticity could speak louder than any political or social agenda. The studio was silent for a beat, but then to the host's surprise, the audience began to clap. It wasn't a loud, boisterous applause, but slow, genuine recognition of the wisdom Keanu had just shared. The host, still trying to regain their composure, smiled thinly. "Well, Keanu, you certainly have a way of making people think." Keanu smiled back, nodding, and in that moment, the interview felt less like a debate and more like a learning experience for everyone involved. As the applause died down, the energy in the studio had completely transformed. The tension that had previously hung in the air like a heavy cloud had dissipated, replaced by an atmosphere of respect and quiet admiration. The host, though still struggling to regain control of the interview, could feel the shift. They had hoped for a confrontation, for a moment that would turn into a viral spectacle, but instead, Keanu had calmly guided the conversation toward a place of reflection, leaving the host and the audience to reconsider what it meant to truly stand for something. The audience, who had initially come into the interview ready for a spectacle, were now in a state of quiet contemplation. They were no longer waiting for the next fiery exchange or dramatic retort. Instead, they were processing the weight of Keanu's words. Some nodded thoughtfully, others looked at each other in surprise, as if they had been unexpectedly given a new perspective on the very idea of standing for something. The younger crowd, especially, seemed to appreciate Keanu's refusal to play into the woke narrative that was dominating the media. There were whispers among the crowd. Some were discussing Keanu's points with each other, while others simply sat back, absorbed in his calm yet powerful response. For a brief moment, it felt like the entire room had united in a shared understanding, where the usual divisions and labels were set aside in favor of a deeper, more meaningful conversation about individual values, humility, and the importance of dialogue. Keanu, noticing the change in energy, glanced around the room. He hadn't intended to cause such a stir. He simply wanted to speak from the heart, without fear of judgment. But now he could sense that something bigger had happened. His approach wasn't about winning an argument. It was about planting a seed of thought, one that would grow long after the cameras stopped rolling. The host, realizing they were no longer in control of the narrative, cleared their throat and attempted to move forward. "Well, Keanu, it's clear that you have a unique approach to these issues. And while I might not agree with everything you've said tonight, I think we can all agree that you've made us rethink how we approach conversations about social change." Keanu simply nodded, his expression still calm. "That's all I'm hoping for, an open conversation where we can listen and learn from each other." The host, still a bit flustered but now genuinely respecting Keanu's point of view, gave a small smile. "All right, Keanu. I think we've had enough of the heavy stuff for tonight. Let's move on to something a little lighter, shall we?" The audience, now clearly on Keanu's side, chuckled at the host's awkward pivot. The mood had lightened, but the underlying respect for Keanu's authenticity remained. The host, now aware that they had been outmaneuvered, looked slightly embarrassed but graciously steered the conversation away from the topic they had hoped would ignite conflict. As the interview moved on to lighter topics, the energy in the room stayed different. The usual sense of spectacle and drama had been replaced by a feeling of quiet reflection. The audience was no longer just watching a celebrity being interviewed. They were witnessing a man who had used his platform to challenge the status quo, to stand firm in his beliefs, and to bring a sense of balance to an often chaotic world. Keanu had shifted the dynamic, not through loud protest, but through his simple, unwavering presence. By the end of the interview, it was clear Keanu had won more than just the audience's applause. He had earned their respect. The quiet power of his responses had resonated far more than any viral soundbite could have, and it left everyone in the room with something to think about long after the lights went down. As the interview came to an end, Keanu stood up, giving the host a respectful handshake and offering a polite nod to the audience. The applause that followed wasn't just for the typical thank you at the end of an interview. This time it felt different. more sincere. The audience wasn't clapping because they were expected to, but because they genuinely appreciated the conversation they had just witnessed. They had been exposed to a perspective they weren't used to hearing, a voice that didn't get caught in the noise of divisiveness and politics, but instead focused on unity and understanding. Keanu made his way off the stage, still calm, his presence unassuming despite the impact his words had made. As he exited, a few crew members greeted him with quiet nods of respect, silently acknowledging that something significant had just taken place. Keanu, however, didn't act as if he had just appended a media narrative. He was simply going about his day, as humble as ever, unaffected by the praise or the controversy that might soon follow. Outside the studio, as the episode aired live, social media exploded. Clips from the interview quickly went viral. Headlines blared, Keanu Reeves stuns talk show host with unfiltered wisdom on woke culture. Keanu Reeves refuses to play into political polarization, leaves talk show host speechless, and Keanu Reeves defends kindness over political correctness in epic live interview. Within hours, Twitter, Instagram, and news outlets were buzzing with discussions about Keanu's message. Some were praising him for his clarity and depth, others for his ability to remain unshaken in the face of pressure. But one thing was clear, Keanu's words were resonating with people far beyond the walls of the studio. His message had sparked a wave of reflection across the media landscape. People who had spent years caught in the back and forth of partisan debates were now starting to question the way they approach social discourse. His call for balance, respect for different perspectives, and the importance of listening rather than reacting had struck a chord, and it felt like something had shifted in the cultural conversation. In the days that followed, countless articles and opinion pieces were written about Keanu's interview. Some celebrated his refusal to succumb to the usual binary way of thinking, while others critiqued him for not being vocal enough on issues. But what remained consistent across all the reactions was that Keanu had invited a conversation that wasn't just about politics. It was about humanity. It was about connecting with people on a deeper level, about realizing that we are all, in some way, more similar than we are different. People from all walks of life, fans, critics, ordinary citizens, commented on how refreshing it was to hear someone speak with such sincerity, even when it wasn't convenient or trendy. The interview had sparked an outpouring of comments about how people longed for more nuanced discussions and how the loudest voices weren't always the most insightful. Keanu had reminded them that, sometimes, the most powerful action you can take is to just remain true to yourself. For Sarah, a young mother living in a small apartment with her baby, Keanu's words hit home. She had been struggling with the noise of social media, the endless back and forth about right and wrong, and the pressure to fit into labels that didn't reflect who she was. After watching the interview, she felt a shift within herself. Keanu's approach wasn't just about politics or public life, it was about personal integrity, and it gave her the strength to move forward with her own life on her terms. Across the globe, messages like Sarah's poured in. Keanu's interview had sparked not only a cultural conversation but also a personal one for many people. His quiet strength had reminded everyone that their own journey didn't have to be defined by external pressures. They didn't need to have all the answers. They just needed to stay true to their core values and act with kindness, empathy, and respect. As Keanu walked through the streets of his hometown a few days later, the usual buzz of the city felt different. He felt the weight of the world's attention, but he also felt a sense of peace. The ripple effect of that interview was still unfolding. He didn't seek fame or validation, he never had, but the small impact his words had made felt bigger than any role he had ever played on screen. In the end, it wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room, but about being a voice that truly listened. For Keanu, the message was simple. The world needed less conflict and more understanding, and he was content knowing that he had contributed, just a little bit, to a more meaningful conversation. The days following the interview saw a surge of public and media attention unlike anything Keanu had ever experienced. The interview, initially perceived as another typical talk show appearance, had turned into a cultural moment. Social media platforms erupted with discussions, and news outlets scrambled to cover the profound impact Keanu's words had left on the audience. On Twitter, the hashtag #KeanuWisdom trended worldwide. Celebrities, political commentators, and everyday people weighed in, sharing their thoughts on Keanu's calm demeanor, his refusal to bow to pressure, and his insistence on finding common ground. Some expressed admiration for his ability to challenge the status quo without getting involved in the petty, combative narratives that often define public debates. Others, however, criticized him for not aligning himself more directly with any particular cause, questioning whether his neutrality amounted to complacency. But what stood out most was the number of people, particularly those from younger generations, who found themselves reassessing their own views on public discourse. The conversation had shifted from polarizing, extremist positions to one of introspection and dialogue. Keanu had subtly reminded people that engagement didn't have to mean choosing sides or raising your voice the loudest. Sometimes, it was about sitting back, listening, and remaining true to who you were. In the wake of the interview, Keanu received an outpouring of support from fans and followers who had long respected his privacy and humility. Many shared personal stories of how they had struggled with the pressure to take sides on various issues, and how Keanu's approach had given them the courage to think independently. His message had resonated on a deeply personal level, prompting people to reconsider how they approached not only social issues but their own relationships with others. A few days later, Keanu found himself sitting down with a group of close friends, having dinner at a small restaurant in Los Angeles. They didn't talk much about the interview. Keanu wasn't the type to seek validation or bask in the spotlight. Instead, the conversation revolved around simple topics: movies, books, travels, and the personal lives of his friends. But as they ate and laughed, one of his longtime friends, a fellow actor, leaned in and said with a grin, "You've got the internet buzzing. That interview, what you said, it's like you just hit reset on the whole woke debate." Keanu laughed softly, shrugging. "I don't know about all that. I didn't expect it to go that way. I just said what was on my mind." His friend raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, but the way you handled that, host, you made them look like they had no idea what they were doing. You didn't play into their narrative. That's something we all could learn from." Keanu smiled, his expression humble as ever. It wasn't about playing anything, really. Just saying what feels right. It's funny, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to stay calm and listen. People get so caught up in the noise, they forget that. The conversation drifted to other topics, but the weight of the interview hung in the air, a reminder that Keanu's quiet strength had made a lasting impact. In the coming weeks, other celebrities began to weigh in on his response. Some spoke about how they admired his ability to rise above the noise, while others acknowledged that, despite their differences, Keanu had prompted them to consider the importance of balance in the way they interacted with the public. One major news outlet even published an op-ed piece titled, "Keanu Reeves and the Power of Silence in the Age of Outrage." The piece explored how Keanu's refusal to get drawn into divisive debates reflected a broader shift in public discourse, a desire to move beyond the extremes and focus on finding common ground. The article became one of the most shared pieces that month, prompting more people to think about how they engaged with controversial issues. Keanu, however, remained unfazed by all the attention. While others debated the implications of his words, he focused on what mattered most to him: his work, his personal life, and the quiet impact he could make in the lives of those around him. In the end, he knew that he hadn't solved the world's problems, but he had done something far more meaningful. He had opened a door for people to have a different kind of conversation, one rooted in understanding, not division. As the world continued to buzz with reactions to the interview, Keanu returned to his usual routines, stepping back into the public only when he felt it was necessary. The ripple effect of his words, however, would continue to echo throughout the media landscape, reminding everyone that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is listen and remain true to yourself. Despite the media frenzy surrounding his interview, Keanu found solace in the quiet spaces of his life. After the initial surge of public reactions had died down, he took a step back from the constant media cycle and returned to the simple, grounded life that he cherished. He didn't let the praise or the criticism weigh him down. Instead, he spent more time reading, reflecting, and reconnecting with the people and activities that brought him peace. One afternoon, Keanu sat alone in his favorite park, nestled in a quiet corner, the sun casting long shadows across the grass. He often came here when he needed to think, to find clarity. The world around him was calm. Children played nearby, joggers passed by, an elderly couple walked their dog. Keanu took a deep breath, feeling a sense of gratitude for the simplicity of these moments. The interview had stirred something in him, something he hadn't fully anticipated. It had caused him to reflect on his role not just as an actor, but as a public figure, someone whose words and actions carried weight, whether he intended them to or not. He hadn't set out to spark a movement, but the conversation that had followed his response to the host had led him to think more deeply about how he could continue living with authenticity, both in his personal life and in his public appearances. Keanu wasn't the type to make grand gestures or take up a cause just for the sake of being seen doing it. That wasn't his way. But the response to his words made him realize that sometimes simply speaking with clarity, with respect for others, and without the need for validation could have a ripple effect that went far beyond what he had ever imagined. As the days passed, Keanu began to have more conversations with friends and colleagues about the interview's aftermath. Many of them praised him for staying true to himself and for setting an example of how to handle public pressure without losing sight of what truly mattered. He talked with his close circle about how to continue maintaining a balance in a world that often demanded extremes. One evening, after catching up with an old friend who had watched the interview, Keanu reflected aloud, "I think there's something important in not being afraid to challenge what's considered normal by society. Not through confrontation, but through showing that we can still hold our values without getting caught in the noise. There's more strength in that than people realize." His friend nodded thoughtfully, adding, "That's exactly what you did. You didn't need to fight back. You just calmly showed there's another way, one that doesn't follow the crowd." Keanu smiled, grateful for the support and the perspective his friends offered. It was clear to him now that his role in society, as a celebrity and as a person, wasn't to always be at the forefront of cultural conversations or make headlines. Sometimes it was simply to model integrity and authenticity in a world that often valued spectacle over substance. A few weeks later, Keanu found himself back in a familiar setting, a movie set, preparing for a new role. As he walked through the bustling set where crew members hurriedly set up lights and props, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come, not just in his career, but in his understanding of what it meant to be true to oneself in the public eye. He didn't need to be the loudest voice in the room or get caught up in every controversy. He simply needed to remain grounded in his own values and trust that, over time, those actions would have a more meaningful impact than any flashy statement could. Keanu's quiet reflection led to a deeper understanding of his own purpose. It wasn't about playing a part in someone else's narrative, but about remaining true to the person he had always been. And while the interview had sparked much conversation, he knew that his journey wasn't about becoming a political figure or activist. It was about living his life with integrity, letting his actions speak louder than words, and encouraging others to do the same. In the end, Keanu's message was simple. True change comes not through noise, but through understanding and action. And with that belief, he continued to move through the world with the same quiet strength that had always defined him, knowing that the legacy he wanted to leave wasn't one of fame or controversy. It was one of authenticity and compassion.